Andrew, thanks for joining us here at Preaching Matters. You've been teaching Matthew chapter 21 to 25 for a while at Christ Church Liverpool. Tell us why you think it's a distinct section.
I do think that 21 to 25 thing is a section. I'm always a little bit suspicious of that whole kind of idea because I do think they can be a bit arbitrary, and we know Matthew wrote a whole gospel and we have no idea whether he stopped for lunch or anything like that at different points. But what happens at the beginning of chapter 21 is after this sort of procession, if you like, and a whole pile of things that happen on a journey, the Lord Jesus arrives in Jerusalem. There's this triumphal entry on the donkey that's, I guess, so familiar to us. And then at the end of chapter 25, after a whole pile of teaching in and around the temple, a lot of which is about the temple and the fate of the temple and the destruction of the temple and of national Israel, we get chapter 26, verse 1, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, he says some stuff to his disciples, and the chief priests make a sort of definite and sort of definitive plot to kill Jesus. And that does seem to mark a transition into the final section.
And in this distinct section of Matthew, what do you think he's trying to achieve?
I think it's really much the same as the rest of the gospel. So in chapter 1, verse 1, it's very clear that we're learning about Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David. And really the whole gospel, I guess, is given over to that question, well, what does it mean for Jesus to be Messiah, and what kind of Messiah is he, and what will he do, how will he come? And loads of themes in this section are actually continued from previous parts of the gospel, especially this whole idea of people not really understanding the kind of Messiah that Jesus is. That's set up for us really brilliantly, one of my favourite little sections just before chapter 21, at the end of chapter 20, where you get Zebedee's sons, who we know from the other Gospels to be James and John, come with... It's cringe. I mean, they must have read this and cringed. They come with their mum. Oh, how embarrassing is that? And their mum asks if they can be the Foreign Secretary and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, or the sort of right and left hand in Jesus' glory. And I mean, apart from the fact that if you really want those jobs, you probably should have grown out of your mum asking for them. There's this total failure to really see what kind of King Jesus is. So starting with that incident, I guess, sets us up that even the people who've been following Jesus around for years, they have no kind of clue, really, what he's going to do.
How does Matthew achieve that?
I guess a lot of what he does is sort of blow away our preconceptions or the ideas that we might come with, even, to be honest, if we've already read 20 chapters of his gospel. The idea of a kind of controlling section or passage always feels a little bit dangerous, because the real danger isn't there we read one passage and then we sort of filter all the rest of the gospel through a sort of grid where we've decided what that passage is. But nevertheless, I did find for me as I was preaching through this that chapter 21 verses 1 to 11, which is the triumphal entry, is really helpful and important in understanding the whole of the section. Because the Jesus who's presented to us in chapters 21 to 24, to be honest, he's frankly a little bit terrifying. There's a whole pile of stuff which is quite hard and hard-edged and brutal about the judgment that is to come, about, one will be taken and another will be left, about the sheep and the goats that go away from me, I never knew you. There are some quite hard things in here. And I think, particularly perhaps given our sort of culture, it'd be very easy for people to read those and sort of feel like, well, Jesus is this very unpleasant, controlling, kind of manipulative character. And the triumphal entry both sort of confirms the great kingship of Jesus, but also provides a kind of, not quite a qualification, but a little bit of a control to these very kind of, hard passages about his judgment. I just found I kept coming back to it when we were teaching it and saying, look, the kind of king he is very powerful and he's completely in control, but he's not manipulative and he's not out to use people for his own ends. He's actually going to serve people and to love them and to care for them and to bring them blessing. He does demand our complete allegiance, giving coins to Caesar and giving everything to God. But that's not an exploitative thing, it's a liberating thing because he's the humble, gentle king. I guess some of the other passages then that sort of follow on from that, one of the expectations lots of people had, and I guess still have today, is that the Messiah is really for the extra good people. And it's very striking that in the next section, the temple incident with the coins and the money changers, he enters the temple, and you get the sense that people think what he's going to do is he's going to turf the Romans out, he's going to overthrow the bad guys. And yet what he actually does is throw out and overturn the people who seem to be doing the thing that's essential for the temple, who seem to be doing God's work by providing the sacrifices and changing the money, and welcomes in instead the blind and the lame and the children and the people who were excluded. Then the next little bit, end of chapter 21, you've got these parables that he tells about the two sons and about the tenants. And again, it's very much aimed at the people who think that the king is going to come in judgment on the others and sort of affirm them. Actually, they turn out to be the enemies of the real king. I think that's very sobering to read that as a kind of churchgoer and as a kind of moral person, I guess, in our society. It really wakes you up.
What's the danger of forgetting that Jesus really is like that?
I think the danger with Jesus is that we always want to make him in our own image. The classic passage for that, and I was really struck by this when we were preaching through it, is chapter 22, 15 to 22, which is this passage about paying coins to Caesar. And almost every time I've heard that passage preached, which is quite a few times, it's about the relationship between the church and the state. It's about, and the main sort of theme sentence of the passage becomes something along the lines of you should pay your taxes and be a good citizen, which is certainly an entirely biblical principle, but I'm not really convinced it's what's going on here. I think in a very subtle way, Jesus is saying, yes, you should pay your taxes to the people who are listening. And he's sort of taking one side in this debate that goes on between the kind of, the conformists, I guess, to Roman rule and the radicals and the rebels. But actually, the more you read the passage, he's not really very interested in any of those questions at all. I think it's really striking, this whole thing where he basically says, show me the coin. And then he basically says, whose image is it? It's Caesar's. And I imagine him almost just sort of chucking it into the air and going, well, it's Caesar's, whatever. And he really seems to be getting into a kind of, I don't care about any of this stuff. It's not that important to me. And instead focusing on this idea of image. So whose image are you made in? It's not Caesar's image, but very obviously to any Jewish audience that recalls the Genesis story in being made in God's image. And he's then saying, well, okay, so we'll give your image, the image of God in you, back to him, which is everything. And Jesus is saying, no, I don't want you to have your own agenda about anything. I don't want you to have some causes that you go, Jesus is into my cause. He supports my cause, whether that's saving the whales or free market capitalism or whatever my thing is. Actually, what he says is, I want you to be entirely loyal to my cause. My cause is everything. Anything else is just kind of nothing. And I just found that phenomenally sobering, because I just think all the time I have these things that are important to me, and then I try and find ways in which Jesus supports them, rather than asking the question, is this thing important to him, and do I support it? And I think we constantly just make Jesus in our own image, and he conveniently supports the things that we happen to be in favour of and that suit us. That's exactly what the Pharisees do, and I found it just very challenging to be forced to reflect upon, do I really follow Jesus' agenda, or is he just a kind of flag of convenience that sort of suits my causes and the things that I happen to be supporting?
What is it that excites you about all of this?
I've been really thrilled by teaching this, perhaps more than I can remember for a sort of single section of the Bible for a while, really. I guess first it really has persuaded me of the truthfulness of the Gospels. So the more I've kind of thought about this, I just think the Jesus who's presented here is so vastly more radical than any sort of conservative first century Jewish person like Matthew would ever have made up. I think it makes it very obvious that this is really who he was and the words of a person who really walked around in history. So that's been encouraging. Secondly, I think it's given me real confidence sharing Jesus with people. Just this idea that whoever he is, he's not merely offering another sort of system to live by, just another alternative to sort of tiled old sort of ways of thinking about things, whether that's free market capitalism or Marxism or whatever it might be. He's actually offering just a totally different kind of life with a totally different ruler in charge of it, and I think that's been really encouraging.
Andrew, thanks for joining us here at Preaching Matters.
That's been a pleasure, thank you.